Welcome to another episode of the Offer Letter Candidate Spotlight. And today we have Jonny Hammond joining me. Jonny, welcome to the show.
Hey, nice to meet you. Nice to be here.
Yeah, good to meet you too. And for everybody kind of tuning in, and could you just give everybody just a quick background of your professional experience, kind of who you are and what you do on a professional level?
Yeah, certainly. I am a front end software engineer. I've recently added a little bit more to become a full stack developer, but definitely more on the visual side of things. I work with languages like JavaScript, React, PHP, and I've really worked across a variety of spectrums, whether it's content management systems or a small startup or like even SaaS software now. And I also have a big interest in data analytics. So from here and there, I occasionally get to work in an Excel spreadsheet or a dashboard or something as well.
Yeah, and I'm really excited for this conversation because we'll get into some of that background that you've done in the analytical world, a little bit in the programming side, and to kind of just kick off, like you just mentioned, you've worked across a really broad set of roles and skills. You went from support to an analyst position. You've done front end, back end, full stack. Walk us through some of that career progression and how you have kept yourself kind of moving forward as a professional, and how you keep learning all these new skills as you keep moving forward.
Yeah, totally. I used to work in the restaurant industry about a decade ago, and I ran into this issue where unless I was getting the food for free, I couldn't really afford the food that I was cooking at that restaurant. And I decided I wanted to get into a different industry. So I decided I wanted to get into tech, and I really didn't have much of a tech background. So I used my sales background in order to sell laptops, and I got pretty good at that. But it wasn't a commission role, and there was a lot of driving, and it was pretty capped, and wasn't really big on being a vendor at like places like Best Buys. So it was the same issue where I started to notice that I couldn't afford the laptops that I was selling to people, and I I've always been a big problem solver, at least in terms of conversation, like I'm not like the most mathematical person, but when it comes to just discussion and like wanting to have your facts straight, I'm a big fan of data in that regard. And I first got into tech from just the notion of like data analytics or data science, just being able to like visualize data, simplify data, ensure that it's like reliable, like accurate, factual data. Like think of like modern times where like people talk about like things like whether it's like business or political or day to day, Facebook or whatever it is. It's like a lot of times people just don't have their facts straight. And so that's sort of what the appealing side of data was to me, is just have everyone point at a data point and have it be indisputable. But as a person that got into data science, I was getting a liberal arts degree, and I was like, okay, I need to start doing this slowly but surely. And I started learning a little bit of Python. And a few months after that, I was like, okay, I need to see something visually about this. And I got into HTML, CSS, JavaScript. And then for 4 or 5 years after that, I became, front end web developer. Did a bunch of roles in between, again, just contract roles, like IT help desk analyst. That's how I transitioned out of selling laptops to troubleshooting desktops and Windows IT stuff for people. And then during the pandemic, I got hired as a support analyst. And that role became a front end developer role because my first week was when we all had to work from home. There was like a statewide quarantine in Massachusetts for most of the year after that. And their website wasn't responsive. So instead of being trained a whole lot on support analytics stuff, I was able to retrofit their website, make it mobile responsive. And then I took a coding boot camp, and I've pretty much been pursuing web developer roles since then. My career trajectory has definitely changed a little bit since then too, but I've been rambling a little bit. It's hard to summarize job history when you've had a lot of contract roles.
And so you started learning Python, right? That was the first language you started learning in that era. Like, well, I don't want to say it was, but how did you start learning that without going to a coding boot camp or even at a university level, right? Like, where did you start learning Python?
It was miserable. I was There was this book called Learn Python the Hard Way. I think it was by Zed Shaw, and I was reading a book on Python 2, and I was working and staying up until like 3 in the morning trying to just learn and code. And that's sort of where I created like my first application through the terminal. I'm pretty sure my first little app was like a calorie intake calculator where you kind of did all these calculations based off of like your weight and height and gender and age and stuff like that. You could put in like how much you weigh and how much you were trying to weigh or something like that. And I made a big mistake early on, which was not understanding how we learn. I actually read a really cool book called Learning How to Learn, which is kind of geared towards kids, but it was super insightful. And basically, I was trying to stay up all late hours, kind of like I had the restaurant industry mentality where it's just like, just bang it out, work hard, and do it for as long as you need to. But then I'd be cooked for the rest of the week and I'd be catching up on sleep and I wouldn't really retain things early on. So it took me like about like a year or two to realize that it was much better to do a little bit each day. It's just it's hard for someone who likes to binge, but doing it a little bit each day was way better. You retain and learn way more.
Yeah, I mean, I'm the same way. I was the person who crammed for every exam and tried to learn everything in the last minute. So I can completely empathize with you on that. So looking back in some of your early roles, you used to work really closely with users and clients. What lessons from that time really influenced how you look at some of the things that you're building now?
But yeah, for sure. I would say one of my favorite roles in the past 5 years was when I worked at Kimball. They're now Kintata now. That was when I was a true support analyst and not really a developer. I was able to use SOQL, which is Salesforce Object Query Language. So it's basically like SQL, where you query like objects or like a database. Just you know what you're looking for, you find it, you pull it back. A lot of business analysts in the B2B side were asking questions about how something worked or why they couldn't find something. And I was able to use a lot of querying to then answer their questions. And a lot of times it would be jumping on a phone call. And that's especially since a couple jobs that have been like not customer facing since then. I've realized that I definitely like the people side of things. I like just speaking to people. I like using technology, but for sure the talking to people part is a big factor of what I enjoy. I just don't like to stuff my face behind a computer screen like 40 hours a week. But, when you tie that into talking to people, getting that satisfaction of helping them out, obviously it's a little different when it comes to web development. I would say the the few interactions that I have, if I were to go back to when I worked at AATS, they provided a workshop for continuing medical education to like physicians. And that's the website that I had a retrofit during the pandemic. And it was just really nice being able to have a website be mobile responsive and know that I was helping out physicians, helping people access through their tablets, through their phones more easily. I would say another big thing was in I worked at a startup role that was kind of a stealth startup, so I can't name the people, but it was this project called Acronary. And the fun thing about it was they had paid someone to do the entire Figma. So the web design was just there for me to pick up and run with. And I did it all in React and Material UI, and I worked with the CTO. So he had the APIs all set up through Python and Fast API, and I just integrated that into the product. And that part was all fine and well, but you get to a part where you finish the Figma and then you start to realize like, oh, this doesn't actually make sense. Or like, do we want this to be like a next button that it goes to the next page or infinite scroll or something where you can just like scroll perpetually like inside of it. And it was really fun to be able to make like custom features and make those features align with the UI that they had already decided on. I wouldn't say that I'm the biggest, how would you put it? I'm not like a graphic designer or like a UI UX person. I'm very big on UI UX. Like I don't like making websites that annoy people for sure.
And we've all used those.
But yeah, I mean, sometimes it's as simple as like a button should do what you expect it to do. And that could be that the button for some reason, somehow people manage to screw up the cursor sometimes. Like sometimes you ever have to like put the mouse like a little far away from a component for it to work.
Yes.
That's confusing. Or maybe just something like it doesn't turn into like the finger cursor. It's just like the arrow icon and it doesn't completely look like a button, or it doesn't work. Like for some reason it's disabled or an error pops up, or it's just such a long response time that you don't know if it worked or not. And then by the time you click it, maybe you just mess things up. So that's just an example of ways a button could screw up. And then you get in accessibility too, right? Where I consider accessibility sort of like within the umbrella of user experience, because this year I found out I have ADHD. And I feel like there's a big thing about the distractibility of a web page. But when everyone talks about accessibility, I think a majority of the time, someone who's not necessarily like in the throes of it would probably think of someone who's like vision impaired or like hearing impaired. But for sure, for me, it's like if you have a page that's too noisy, too many things animated, moving around, too much content, and we could talk about it later, but that's sort of what led me to work on the Chrome extension tool that I'm building out right now too, is just trying to have an ADD tool that can make it easier to understand a web page.
Yeah, and we'll get into that because I was really curious on why you started that project, but I'll get into that in a little bit. But so a big part of your recent work was working with Ruby on Rails with a strong test driven development mindset. So, how did working with a strict TDD test-driven development, for anybody listening that doesn't know, changed the way that you approach building some features?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I'm working on it right now in my project. Test-driven development was something that we used on both repositories. So when I was working in React and TypeScript, it was test-driven development through Storybook, and through Ruby on Rails on the back end, it was through RSpec. And either way, it was sort of designed that you would write a test that would fail first, like the red, and then you would write the code to make the test pass, and you'd make it green, and then you'd eventually refactor it. And it completely changed the way that I approach stuff, because before getting this job, I was doing my own stuff, right? So I'm doing WordPress websites for city councilors. I'm helping people on their side projects. I am trying to work with the stuff that I learned at my last role, which was previously it was Boston Children's Hospital, which was very accessibility focused, but primarily in like WordPress and Drupal, not really any testing at all. And so going from just learning to new technologies and making things work and do what you expect them to do, to test driven development, which is very like, I almost consider TDD part of FDD, which is a phrase I'm making up, but since everyone does DDs, let's just do it. Like feedback driven development, right? One thing that I was struggling to learn was that with TDD, you have to understand what you're writing just to make it fail, which is was a very big mind change for me. Is just like you have to write something that fails first, and it kind of comes down to understanding what type of test you're writing, right? Like the UI, maybe a title or some type of component, something that the user is like interacting with to get to their goal, but then not necessarily like integration stuff. It's still something that I'm familiarizing myself with because this is my first opportunity with it all. But the idea is that you write something that fails, and then you make it pass, and then you would sort of iterate it through feedback. Like some roles, they actually want you sort of committing every single day to the repository. And that was just completely different from what I had worked in previously. I've worked in some jobs where it was just like, again, with the startup where it was a little more like get it done. It was just about like producing and pushing it out as much as possible. And this job was it almost felt like a weird like manufacturing sense. But luckily I had some great senior developers there that really were able to hammer home how it makes you write less code, it helps you write better code. And obviously along with TypeScript, there's just TypeScript and TDD just helps you figure out things sooner than later. That could be like buggy or things that you have to like clarify. I consider it a necessary evil because I still don't like doing it, but it's something that's especially useful if you're just like vibe coding, for example. Like right now, I'm working on a project that again I'll get into later on, but I'm making sure to use like a test driven development approach even through Cursor, just so that way we have 300 tests, which makes it a lot more confident that when you're changing something, it's not breaking a bunch of stuff. So it's been cool just to kind of use it as a guardrail for AI as well.
Yeah, and you kind of just answered my next question too. You kind of started to allude to this, but for people who hear TDD and think that it slows everything down, what would you say to that kind of phrase?
I would say that when I saw my bosses who were like senior staff level, just wizards, it didn't really slow things down. It was just a matter of doing it that way. I think that it takes a while to learn, and it can definitely
Hmm.
slow things down if you're not used to that. I also don't. I don't want. I'm not going to die on the hill and say that it needs to be that way either. Does it bring benefits? Like, yeah, I'm sure there's a reason why it's become so popular and sort of like I don't want to call it like an industry standard, but it seems to be more and more like that. Like 5 years ago, I don't think uh, TypeScript was in every last job, but now it seems like if you only know JavaScript and not TypeScript, it seems to be the same thing with TypeScript and TDD. The way I look at it is it's definitely useful, but again, it was at least salary wise, I was previously working at a job that was not using testing at all. And I was making stuff and I was working across a variety of technologies. And so for a similar paycheck, I was doing TDD at one place, zero testing at all at another place. I wouldn't say zero testing, but it was more like QA. You know what I mean? It was just like going in and making sure that it works. I don't think it necessarily needs to be that way. I just think that for people that implement it properly, it's probably not going to be the thing that makes your business go out of business, right? Like if only we hadn't transitioned over to TDD. I don't know if I've spoken to someone yet who's regretted using TDD. It's just switching over to it can be sort of like a change in how you approach web development. And I don't know if everyone is willing to do that. or software development.
How do you think about the relationship between the front ended and the back ended architecture decisions that are being built within the feature for the end to end product?
That's it's tricky. I
Yeah.
would say that I don't have like I'm more of like an associate level, like say like mid-level developer, junior software engineer. So when it comes to architectural decisions and things like like performance, scalability, and things that tie into like DevOps. I think that's part of the response that makes it tricky is that I
Okay.
feel like at a lot of jobs now, I used to think of like DevOps engineer as a different position as like front end or back end. But I feel like sometimes there's a little bit of overlap between like the cloud technologies, especially if a business is smaller and they expect everybody to do a little bit more. In my most previous role, like one insight that I got from it is that the front end person can own the front end base and the back end person can own the back end code base. And it's nice that they both operate through the same thing, like whether it's like test driven development or like whatever. But one person's going to do it their way. And then if they have people into their code base, they're going to try to align it with that. And the same thing with the back end. I would say that like where things overlap is important, right? Like the API and understanding that if you need some technology done on the back end, it may be a question on do you need it also on the front end? Or if you need a product feature, is this already sustainable? Is this work that's going to need to be done by two people or one person? And I think sometimes just the ways that it ties into each other is really the first thing that comes to mind. But I think there's a lot of ways where, when you're making testing components, a certain programming language on the front end, you're going to try to make it easier to maintain, readable, more performant. So not necessarily like unnecessarily like looping or making like additional requests or things like that. And the same thing with the back end where you're going to try to make it more efficient and with the same qualities as before, but there's certain times where it's like mutually exclusive. And again, there's so many more things that I haven't really learned about. I don't really have experience with AWS at my last job. I know we use it at Boston Children's Hospital. And so I would say that that just comes down to setting up your that's when it gets wonky, you know what I mean? Because like when you think of AWS, you got light sail boxes, and that's where you could host like a Drupal website. And at that point, you might have the same person doing front end, back end, and DevOps or something like all within that same project. It's just tricky because it's not really black and white. And I would just say that, sometimes there's things that I've observed that are more important. Like again, like an API, if you need a feature to do something, is that back end work? Is that front end work? Is it both? Do you already have it? Do you already have it on one side? So definitely just making sure that the data can come from one way to the front end to the back end. And it depends on repositories too. Like I'm sure that there's other places where there's a single repository, maybe like a monorepo or something. But I've worked at a lot of places where the repositories communicate with each other. And because of that, it was somewhat of a separation of concerns until they needed to integrate with each other.
Something you just said that I've never actually thought about, but as a person who's not technical by any means, but somebody who owns roadmap for software, I've always thought of API only as a back end. But what you had just said is APIs. Sometimes it's blurred if it's front end or back end. But you have a really good point because it is also you are seeing it on both sides. So it's something I never thought about until just now.
Yeah, it's something. It was definitely a doozy getting used to GraphQL because prior to that, I'd only done RESTful APIs. But with GraphQL, definitely it seemed to be an example of like it could be defined in one language on the back end, and it can go through a different language on the front end. There's definitely a front end, back end element to those things of just how you're setting it up in your files and how you're plugging it into your code and how you're shipping it out to sort of be generated across repos and stuff like that. It's something that I have to do a project on myself because I have to get more acquainted with GraphQL. It definitely seems like GraphQL, TypeScript, and TDD are like three things that are becoming more popular at varying levels and would just benefit people to learn. Especially because I'm not a Java guy. I haven't really gotten into Java yet or Go, or there's just so many things I haven't even touched yet that I might as well just continue to get better at what I've been exposed to.
Yeah, and just become an expert at those, right? Besides being a master of all.
Yeah, expert always like gets me. I would say that I have a technical breadth, but I have to increase my technical depth and it's just hard sometimes having all this stuff go through your brain. There's just so much information. And I mean, when I took a coding boot camp, they didn't even say, they kind of grazed over the testing portion. They were saying that like testing wasn't that important. They kind of like really just like poo pooed like the whole QA side of things. And now it's like, again, if you don't know test driven development, you might not get the role. It's not always like the deal breaker, I don't think, in interviews, but like for sure, if you have no experience with TDD, so that was a useless section of the Coney boot camp, and yeah, I just have a lot to learn.
So, in your most recent role that you had, you worked on integration with Twilio related to a project within the company. Take us a little bit of what problems you were trying to solve and what impact did your project have on the business as well.
Yeah, I would say that just for what I can talk about it, at least
Yeah.
it's like um, there's there's a little bit of like layers there. But I would say the easy part was just trying to find some of the variables that connect to like, product, right? Add-on, things like that. We're just trying to figure out like as you're learning about the company and the product itself, trying to figure out like, okay, we need a user who has this data value to get this type of functionality or within the same function if this user has that data value, then we return this type of data. And the Twilio, I would say the hardest part about what I was trying to do was just being 2 months into Ruby on Rails and it looking so different from JavaScript. There's spaces, there's different words, there's like a lot of different, it almost seemed like to be more of like a computer science fundamentals type of issue for me than just JavaScript because there just seemed to be like so many types of things. And again, it could just be that I'm a front end guy. So it was like my first time working with like services and helpers and like the certain like folder structure that I had, like so many things kind of just starting off with a class and just all the syntax being different
Yeah.
was one of the things that I was grateful for my boss helping me out with being patient. But the whole idea was, Carrot has really cool features such as, call tracking, being able to allow real estate agents to um, receive phone calls and mask phone numbers and, all these types of things that helps them be unique and really worth the value as they are. And Twilio sort of factored into some of their call tracking. They have a bunch of like cool AI stuff, but my side of the work was really just tying into how to determine the amount of days that a user had a feature for. It was kind of just communicating with the API on some basic stuff and writing tests. But that's sort of like the general aspect of it, of what I can go into. But just know that like the Twilio was like a big part of like their call tracking feature. And so that's what I got to work on for a few tickets surrounding Twilio. There's also other API stuff too. Like there's an API called SEMrush that appears to work for just like letting you know what's wrong with your website, which is pretty nice. Like whether there's like tags
Wow.
that are missing or images that are broken. So it was like really cool because as I was working on certain APIs, I was able to learn more about the company and like the products that they provided. And that was just a fun thing. But again, Ruby on Rails was such a head scratcher, you could say, compared to someone coming from like JavaScript and React. It was cool though. These guys definitely forced me to like step my game up and like operate at a new level. So there's that.
And why do you say that they made you step up? Is it just the quality that they required? Is it the way that they approach problems? Was it the breadth of products that they offer? Kind of why did they make you feel like you had to step your game up?
Yeah, I feel like part of it was just everyone was operating through TDD. We didn't operate that way through like every repository because there's like multiple repos. So like some of them it was a little bit easier to just like get it done. But some of these other ones where it like really forced you to like break down the problem and not just break down the problem and like tackle it and then make your commit and run the tests and things like that. But to like even like iterate from like break down the problem, write something that fails, write something that passes, get feedback. And it was just sort of like a weird way of it. It almost seemed like I was breaking down a problem, not into like beginning, middle, end, but into like little tiny sections of beginning, middle, end over and over and over again. And also just seeing how one of my managers would go about refactoring things. I would say one to one, add one person on the Ruby side, one person on the TypeScript side, just to get a better idea. I still don't really have an opinion on refactoring stuff, but at the same time, they definitely made me like step my game up. And I think it just forced me to, at least on the TDD side of things, become a little bit more test driven development, which to me alone was like stepping my game up because I'm so used to making a bunch of changes and then committing at the end of like a day and just getting like whatever I got done. Because I'm again at like my previous role, it was like, okay, just commit your stuff by the end of the day, so you're in case your computer breaks. But at this job, it was more so like you should kind of just be working on like one change for each commit. And it was just a lot more like I don't want to say like anal, but like a lot more like nuanced. And so it was stressful, especially because I think that with like ADHD, I think I struggle sometimes with sort of like a certain approach of thinking, like especially learning new stuff and a lot of new stuff at the same time. It was hard to sort of visualize and understand why we were doing it that way. But all the same, it forced me to learn how to do things differently and to be a little bit more diligent with my testing and my commits and my refactor. Because again, that's what it was. It was red green refactor. So it's not just writing a test that fails and then writing code to make it pass, but then afterwards, like refactoring the code a little bit to make it like less redundant and like maintainable, readable, stuff like that.
So let's zoom in on a bit of like what your actual day to day would look like. So if I would sit next to you for a week at work, like we can talk about like a project that you want that you're the most proud of, or however. But how would you? What types of problems would you try to tackle? How would you go after a project? Talk us through like your mindset of tackling what you would try to accomplish.
Yeah. So we would normally have 2 or 3 meetings a week that would have to do with like sprint stuff, right? That seems to be a common thing across a couple jobs that I've had, as you've got like your refinement, your retro, your planning. We would basically understand when the sprint was ending, when the sprint was starting, who was getting what approximate story points things were. And so when it comes to getting your tickets, that didn't necessarily happen on the same day. I think sometimes it would happen on a Monday or a Friday, but you'd start the day off with Slack automated stand up. So just to save us some time, we kind of post on like what we're doing that way. And then the main thing was about trying to just understand the ticket as quickly as possible for a couple of reasons. One, you don't want to waste your day. Two, you want to see if you can get any questions asked before we had our little pair programming sessions later on in the day. And then three, you didn't want to be stuck and then have the sprint coming to an end and then having your stuff overlap into another sprint, right? And with the Confluence, which is what we started off using, it was really just about understanding the ticket, getting your branch set up, and just trying to get to work as soon as you could understand the problem. But that's where communication came into play. We had a bunch of different Slack channels for product, for marketing, for whoever you maybe would need to talk to. There was a bunch of cool guidelines on communication, but the main thing was like try not to DM somebody first. Try to find someone in the group so that way other people can have eyes on it. And that way it's just a little less private and a little bit more documented. But it was really just about understanding the ticket, understanding whatever things you might need, like information, assets, like a Figma design or some type of context from another person that worked there, or like permissions to a different software, and then just writing the code. And again, it was typically like test driven development. So by the end of the day, you would either have your questions ready and reach out to someone and go to our pair programming sessions where you try to figure it out with a more seasoned or informed or senior developer, usually just working with a senior person, or you just work on it and throw in a commit. And then it was up to your boss once they get the PR to come review it. I would obviously go through a lot of automated testing, but usually until people would get used to it, the manager would probably come back with like, why are you using this? Or maybe we can refactor that, or, just some type of code review critique that would either say like, wow, this is good to go. Or like early on when we were starting off, it's just a lot of like refactoring and just being like, hey, make sure you move this into that file or something like that. Again, they were just like really uh, good with their code bases, so they knew how they wanted it. And that's the type of stuff that you learned about. And that was the day to day. Like if you finish your tickets throughout the week, then it's obviously about continuing the life cycle of the ticket, where it's like to do, in progress, in review, done. Sometimes you'd have to reassign a ticket back to the person depending on whether it was something that was a blocker that they needed to provide, or whether it was something that you just weren't going to do. You just close it out as won't do. I would say that the main thing was that even if you finish tickets, there was always going to be more tickets. So as soon as you finish your tickets, you just reach out to people to get more tickets. So it was a never ending story in that regard.
So have you ever had a project that really didn't go as planned? And if so, what were your big takeaways on what you learned during that?
Project that didn't go as planned. I had one ticket where I was writing across PHP and React because it was sort of like a WordPress tool where and I use like ChatGPT a lot with it. I figured out what the PHP meant because I'd only worked with PHP at like a WordPress like Drupal level, so I didn't really need to like get all into the syntax and the classes and stuff. But for this particular one, I needed to, and I figured out what I was needing to connect to the form to make the form work the way that we needed to. And then it turns out that I think that the person who had created this project had left the company. And because of that, things weren't completely clear. And so by the time I asked some follow-up questions when I thought I was near the end of it, they completely changed the scope of the ticket. I would say like it was more so the requirements completely changed. So like some fields were no longer necessary, other fields were expected to have different behavior, additional fields. And I would say that towards the end of it, when I was getting it finished, the one thing that I overlooked, which is something that like a senior developer needed to help me out with, was I needed to mock a feature flag being on so that way I could trigger another field just to test that that field was also operating a certain way. And initially I had left that out because I didn't need to touch the fields. And so my first thought was since I didn't need to touch the fields, I wasn't going to need to test that way.
Mhm.
But when he had tested it, he had noticed that because we had a new field coming in through the API, plugging into certain fields, that it was running into some issue with our new field changes and that field. And so it was just a big learning experience for me that like when you're testing something, make sure to test everything and really don't overlook stuff. Don't take it for granted. If you're gonna overlook something because you haven't really worked with feature flags before, err on the side of asking people and reaching out and just putting in the time to be like, okay, it turns out we didn't need to do that at all, instead of just being like, okay, I didn't touch this, therefore I don't have to test this. That was a big thing for me. And I think it was just because I got so close to finishing the ticket. And then once the ticket completely changed, got 90% close to finishing the ticket again. And then at that point, I was just getting a little, I don't want to call it impatient, but maybe a little bit of that was just trying to be like, okay, now I think this is good and putting it for testing. And I would have preferred that the person reviewing it didn't need to be the person to figure out, that that was something that wasn't done. So it was just a big learning experience for me because again, getting used to working on your own code bases is one thing. Having a ticket that's a little bit more straightforward is another thing. But getting into like super huge code bases that have just like hundreds of models and dozens of languages, or whether it's like Docker, TypeScript, or GraphQL, or Ruby, PHP, it was a lot, but I definitely have to be a little bit more detail oriented moving forward, is what I realized.
Yeah, and it's always hard too, right? If the scope changes, because that's going to change a lot of things that you've already worked on as well, right? Just as the scope change always does. So you're going to have to go back and see where all those changes are going to have to be and start making them too. So yeah, I completely understand. That's a hard one to have come at you.
Yeah, it just came at a hard time in my life too. But I was super happy that I found out this year that I have ADHD because it was easier to, now that I'm finally medicated, it's like I wouldn't say you go from not being able to focus to like focusing, but at least since I have been working on this project, I've been able to put in like 7-hour days pretty easily, and that's huge because there is something annoying about like the dopamine side of ADHD, where like if you're not really like appealing to it, like if the product is boring to you or something, or if like the problem is just like too complicated, like makes it like so easy to get tired and to get like stressed out and flustered. So that's just unfortunately a thing that I've really had to learn, especially as I've transitioned from like web developer to software engineer, because that was the big thing is that for the past couple of years, I've been working as a front end web developer. Didn't matter if it was JavaScript and jQuery or React or PHP and WordPress, and like something that was a little bit more on the content management system side, or even something that was a little bit more on like the startup side where it's just build out this entire front end with like React. Was every time I'd get laid off from a contract role, I'd look at the job descriptions of all the things I'd be applying to, and I'm like, this is more like a software engineering role. And some people say that it's like the same thing, right? Like if you're a front end developer and a back end developer, you're a full stack developer. And if you're a full stack developer, you're probably a software engineer. But going from like web developer to like software engineer, there's just a lot of changes. I feel like one is maybe a little bit more computer science involved. There's a lot more processes. Like, again, test driven development and all these different types of things that I didn't really see as a developer. But each time I was applying for work and I'd see like a front end developer basically would look like a glorified software engineer. And a lot of that too is that, and I'm especially sure that you've seen that in your field, there's a lot of job descriptions that are inaccurate to say the least. They're like, oh, we want a front end web developer with 2 years experience that has experience in like JavaScript, Angular, Vue, Java, Python, Go. And you're like, who are you looking for?
Do you even know as the hiring manager what you're looking for, right?
Yeah, and like there's a lot of LinkedIn jobs I think are scraped from other places, which doesn't help. That's why I've been using hiring.cafe. I feel like their jobs are a lot more curated, a lot more easier for me to understand if I qualify for them, and a lot less scammy too. Because that's the big thing about LinkedIn is a lot of the jobs are usually promoted, a lot of their opportunities like are very scammy. It's very annoying because I should be spending more time learning GraphQL then I should be figuring out, I've probably clicked on the "No, I am not a veteran" box 10,000 times in my job applications, you know what I mean? Like, I should not be filling out EEOs more than I am, like, upskilling, but I
Yeah,
have
I
to.
mean, we could talk about the whole LinkedIn problem, right? They've just started scraping everything because they just want the volume and they want the traction. They want to show that they are the biggest platform, right? So you got Indeed and Google for Jobs. Google for Jobs also has its own problems, right? I don't know if you've used that at all, but they also scrape everything, and a lot of it is just seems like such scammy posts. So anybody out there looking right now, I empathize with you because it is really tough to find. You have to double check and triple check what you're applying to and make sure it's a legitimate posting and it's not a scam.
Yeah, I think the issue is that just like there being a lot of, I mean, this is maybe sounds like a conspiracy, so maybe I shouldn't talk out of my butt. But I feel like a lot of social media companies like bots because the more fake profiles there are, the more users they are, and that wouldn't surprise me if that could somehow go into like a earnings stock, I don't know, something like that, where it's like, look how many users we have, and I feel like it's the same thing with LinkedIn, where it's just like, look how many more companies and job postings we have, and yada yada yada. And it gets really annoying because of the fact that so many of these jobs are probably from places that should be like blacklisted or whitelisted. Like maybe there should be some more verification, just like people can get verified. Maybe companies should too. And if companies get verified that are still sort of on like the gray area scammy side, maybe they at least should be defined in like a certain industry. There's just some places that like as soon as I see their icon, I'm like, I'm logging off LinkedIn. I click on jobs and I see like 7 of them and I'm like, nah, I'm going somewhere else.
Yeah, and like my feedback to anybody as a recruiter, double check what you're applying to because you don't want to apply to something that is a scam, right? Or go to WhatsApp and have conversations with people that are not in the country or even hiring within. They're not even hiring; they're just having conversations with you.
Yeah, I get super happy when I see a greenhouse application. I would say sometimes you could tell if it's scammy based off the type of
Yeah,
application they're using. I kind of assume that anyone who uses, I forget whether it's Workable or Workday, but there's one of these job applying things. I just assume that whoever uses those does care about the person's application experience because I can't tell you how annoying it is to have to make what looks like from your end like you're making a user login for the same product over and over and over and over and over again
that's
for
Workday.
like, yeah, that's Workday. As soon as I apply for a job and someone's using Workday, I just have to like take a slow, deep breath and be like, okay, we're still going to apply, but we're not going to enjoy the process of applying. And it's just so interesting that you've got that Workday experience and then you go on like a greenhouse job and you can literally just click on a window. A lot of your saved, if you have like your address and name on Chrome, it'll like auto populate and then you just update your resume and then you submit. And it's like you can get a accurate submission in a minute, whereas Workday just slows my day down so much that it just seems like less. Because that's the problem, right? Is like so many of us are applying to like dozens, if not hundreds, of jobs, and then we're just sometimes you have to do all these like assessments and stuff before you get hired. Like, okay, I'm applying to hundreds of jobs. Some of them are a slick application experience. Some of them take 10 times as long, and I don't even know if I'm going to be able to submit it by the end of it, right? Sometimes things happen where at the very end, it's like, oh, by the way, we said remote, but like not in your state. And that's always a big pain when something like that happens. And, don't get me started.
Yeah. Let's get back on track here. I could offline talk to you a little bit about some of those things that are out there now, but let's talk a little bit about your experience from an accessibility kind of standpoint, because I think this is super fascinating because I feel like most people who are not engineers or developers can't appreciate how much effort like accessibility goes, just to the same point that you just said. Like a cursor might just be a little bit off, or a button doesn't do what it's supposed to, or but you spent a lot of time working on accessibility. What do you think is something that engineers often underestimate about some of the accessibility aspects of being able to have it on the front end side?
I don't know if it's necessarily that. What was your question about underestimating?
Yeah.
Let's see. Let me think.
Or even from like a standpoint of a day-to-day user, right? Because let's think about how many times you've gone to we're going to pick on municipalities, right? Because anytime you go to a municipal page, like it's not mobile friendly. It's not nothing works just as you want it. I actually just had to sign up for something through our park district, and it seems like the 1990s called. Like, I'm working in Windows 95 again. I should be using my dial-up internet again, and to just go through something. But let's like, what do you think is something that is definitely an underestimated, something that you could be doing as an engineer working on accessibility? What's something that people just don't realize?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'll expand accessibility a little bit here because, like I said earlier, I'm of the opinion that it's under the umbrella of user experience. So, when I look at junior developers that are just trying to get their portfolio checked out and trying to get into the workplace in the first place, one thing I'll notice is that their colors, their text, and their backgrounds, foreground, background contrast, there's a website that you can plug in your hex codes just to make sure that it passes. Because let's say you have an orange text on a red background, that's probably not going to be nearly as accessible as if you have dark gray text on like a beige white background, right? Or reverse. But then there's also about the size of the font, right? Sometimes a color contrast can pass and fail on smaller font sizes. Back to your thing about municipalities, I feel like from my experience at the healthcare role where I was retrofitting the website, I feel like you don't even necessarily have to change around the HTML. You can just add selectors and CSS to the style sheets, and you can make those pages accessible. And there's like no reason why a button needs to be that big on a web page. For me, that's inaccessible even if there's like an ARIA label on that button, right? I think there's a little bit of I always get confused with data because nowadays it seems like you should inform everyone on all the data that you track, but you should probably know where your users are coming from, right? And so if a vast majority of your users are on the desktop and the mobile is just like a secondary thing, okay, like I get it. But a lot of times there's going to be a maybe 50-50. Maybe there's like half the users coming in through mobile. And for that reason, it should be just as important that your code base is sort of designed like probably mobile first, right? In a lot of situations. But for accessibility, just making sure that your images at least are responsive for a user who can see, just to make sure that they don't just look like horrendous, but also that they have alt tags. There's a lot of different ARIA labels and different tags that you can use depending on the situation. It's hard for me to think of all of them off the top of my head, but I would say like the big one, other than like navigation and just making sure that a user can like easily navigate to the things that they need with like a tab as opposed to like someone who's looking around and clicking. This was a specific example, but this was something that we had to create at Boston Children's Hospital. There's sort of a rule of thumb with your images not being too full of text, right? Because that's just kind of not the point of an image typically, is to have like a bunch of words on it. You can't really describe a whole lot of text in like an alt tag. But physicians have like anatomical posters, and sometimes those images actually do need to have a boatload of text on it. And I forget the exact name of it, but there was something like an aria described by. There was like sort of like a way that we could connect like an image to like a paragraph, and we could sort of give it like an extended description of the image, which was like really cool because it was just something that was used like in addition to the alt tag. The alt tag, I think, could only have like certain amount of text before it was either at its capacity or just counterintuitive for SEO. Because that's another big thing too, right? Is like if you want to check your lighthouse on a Chrome website, you could just go into your dev tools and inspect the web page and get an idea of how accessible your website is there too. But again, so just say accessibility stuff, all those different ARIA tags, and just looking up like I want to say level 2 and level 3 are the ones on the accessibility website, just to make sure that you're following those things. But then there's also the idea of like user experience, right? Sometimes just like a little hover is just enough to like indicate to a user that like, oh, this can do a thing, like I should be looking here. Sometimes it's like screen real estate. Like for example, when I look at your video screen right now, I see the poster. Like I see you, I see your chair, but I see the poster in the top corner. And so a lot of times it's going to be like that with like a button that you want users to click on. Maybe there's a primary color and a secondary color. You wouldn't want to have those things reversed, or else the user is probably going to look at the wrong button and be like, oh, this is the most important one based off color. And again, just all these other UX things like you can have white space, you could have the number of characters on a line, and just of course making sure that you're like, you ever have someone text you a giant wall of text compared to like a couple
Yes.
small blurbs? It's the same thing with reading an article, right? Like if you're just having like blog articles that are like one gigantic paragraph of an essay, then that's probably not going to be as readable as other things. And again, that's sort of maybe outside of accessibility, but the way I look at it is like, whether you're vision impaired or you're just easily distracted, or God forbid, like, you have some type of other issue where you can't see flashing objects. You want to make sure that your website doesn't have like a bunch of like animations playing, doesn't have like an auto playing video, even worse, like an auto sound. There's nothing worse. You go on a website and it starts playing audio. That is a crime against humanity. But yeah,
Remember the times where that was a thing a lot.
yeah, and still see it from time to time.
So let's kind of switch gears. Let's talk a little bit about the project that you're working on now. I think it's a great segue into it. So you started doing something that you've on your LinkedIn have started saying 100 days of code. Talk us through this project a little bit. I know you kind of talked a little bit about why you started it, but just for everybody's sake, like if you don't mind reminding us as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Chrome extension that I'm working on is called Doc Summarizer. It's like a summarizer of documents where you are. My initial pain point was just being kind of easily distracted in my last role, like having to read all these documents and then having to switch context from like a Slack message, like a 2 hour meeting, going back to documentation, really trying to have these things all sink in and then work on a ticket. It was just really hard for me to switch context, and documentation reading is crucial, but it also it's something I like to take my time with, right? Especially at a technical level. And so the doc summarizer is something where you can, you click the extension and all you have to do is press summarize, and it'll give you an AI summary of the entire web page that you can either you could ask it questions and then give it a command like 2 paragraphs, and it'll come back with 2 paragraphs summarizing or answering your question. You could do like any number of paragraphs, 1 through 9. You could even prompt it to give you links to like relevant sections on the page. And so you click those links and then it will go to that certain part of the web page, just so that way it's sort of like cite your sources, right? Because a lot of issues that people have with AI, LLM stuff is that it's hallucinating. So it's a lot easier to like be like, okay, give me the facts. And then it gives you the facts and then it links to your sources. I experimented with a bunch of prompt voices as well. So some are more like Socratic, like asking you questions. Some are like simplifier that are more for like ADHD, like ESL inspired voices. And by voices, I mean like you can ask it and it'll talk to you in different ways, right? Some will be more focused on like making sure that you understand. Others will try to give you like a visual mapping of like an overview, maybe like comparisons or something like that. One might be a senior engineer type of voice, another like a patient teacher. Another cool blur feature that I have is the blur. So you can basically like blur the top half and the lower half of the screen. So it's a lot
Oh, that's
easier to
cool.
focus on like what's in the center. And it kind of works in tangent with the links, where once it generates a link, you click the link and it not only scrolls to that part of the page, but it'll highlight it, which I think was a pretty cool feat because of the fact that like these aren't links and highlights that exist on the page before you use the extension, and they're dynamic. Another feature is just the detach window where you can click it. You can basically, if you like to do like split screen or if you have like a bigger computer screen, I figured out a way to make a new window in Chrome be able to communicate to another tab and to be able to continue making requests based off that information there. And I would say, lastly, the key thing about it right now is that it does require an open AI key, like an API key. So someone could put on like $5, $10 on one, and tokens go a long way. Like I've been working on this project for 3 weeks now, and I'm pretty sure I've spent $1.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I'll send you a couple screenshots after this, but one thing that I make sure to put on the bottom of each response, because it's like a very like stateful conversational thing. Like you can
Yeah.
click a summarize button, or you could just prompt it right away. You'll get like dots kind of indicating that it's thinking, and then each response that it gives you at the bottom is there's a little footer. It'll give you the prompt voice that you're using, whether it's default or another one. It'll tell you the response time because it usually takes like 15-20 seconds the first go around because it's taking the entire web page, reducing it to text content, sending in an API request, and then doing some thinking and coming back with a response. But then after that, like the responses go down to like 1 to 5 seconds usually. And you could still change the reasoning on it too. You can make it a little bit more complex reasoning. So it will like think a little bit harder and maybe it'll take a little bit longer, but maybe it'll give you a better answer. But the main thing is that with the OpenAI key, I also show how many tokens are being used for each response, and I quantify it with like the cost based off of like the table of like ChatGPT 5 Nano. So that way a user understands they're spending like 0.00072 cents on this response. And it's just pretty cool just to like let users know like real time, like this is what this is costing you. This is how much time it's taking. And then finally, just because I've ranted a little bit, but this is my passion project, there is an export button too. So let's say you're a med student and you're on this article about like Wellbutrin and you want to summarize it in like a research abstract because that's another voice that I have, and then you have a research abstract on this documentation and you click a button to export it and you can export it as a PDF and then you just have it as a formatted PDF file. You can do that in a minute. So it's a pretty cool project.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple different questions I have here, and we'll see how we answer some of these. Being a project that you're working on, and you have full scope of everything that you're doing, so how is this different from any other project that you worked on in your professional career? You have all the decision making, you have all the scope, you have all the accountability. Like, how does this differ from what you've done professionally? And not to say
I
that
would say, yeah,
this can't lead to something else professionally, but like from other things that you've done.
I would say it's more fun. I would also say it's easier to feel like I can approach myself than it is to like approach like another person. Cause sometimes you feel weird about like pinging the product manager or like the senior developer and just being like, I have no idea what's going on right now. Cause I take pride in not knowing what's going on right now and it'll just help me figure it out. But at the workplace, there's just such a connection of job insecurity. Like I've gotten laid off twice now, and so the fact that like it's always stressful at the workplace just trying to like not get laid off. I got a little bit of PTSD from getting laid off for sure. Like I lived in my car for a few months last year because things got so difficult. But I would just say working on this project, it's a passion project and it's something that I don't have to break away from conversation with. That's probably the biggest thing is I get distracted at work from 2 hour long meetings. Really not a big meetings guy. Also not a big like Slack channel, like look at my family, look what we did this weekend. Like all that stuff is distracting to me. I don't like those types of interactions at all. I'm not antisocial, but I work at the cafe. I have plenty of conversations with the person who's a developer right in front of me because it's that type of cafe. And then
Yeah.
it's like I feel like I get more work done that way. If my last job was a little bit more social, I feel like I would have enjoyed it a little bit more. But yeah, I'm not really big for distractions. And I think it comes down to whether you understand and appreciate the product and the technologies. That's one thing I'm starting to understand more too, is that like if it's a new programming language and a new product, it's gonna be very stressful. But this one right here, it's a new product, but I know exactly what I want and I know how to fix it otherwise. And it's just testing. It's not in production. There's no strict deadlines. I'm trying to get it done ASAP, but I would just say it's a little bit less stressful and a little bit more fun.
And one of the things that we were kind of talking about is that you built this using AI as well, correct? Like you use. So talk us through a little bit about what you used, what tools you used, what made you take those decisions to use those tools as well.
Yeah, definitely. So I first started out using ChatGPT just to like see if an idea I have in mind is possible, right? Because usually it can tell you pretty quickly if like an API can do a certain thing or if there's going to be hangups. And then once I had this idea in mind, I was first creating it through ChatGPT just because I was really going off of OpenAI's documentation. Like I was spending like a full few days just documenting like the full like API page for the response API. And it was taking me too long, which is always what happens when I finally do it like manually. But then after about a week or so, when ChatGPT was starting to hit its context limits and it wasn't really remembering the project and it was just a hassle trying to like summarize it and open it up in a new window over and over again, I just moved over to Cursor, which is basically like VS Code. It's a text editor. It's just a fork of that, and you can have your AI agent inside of it. It has this cool feature like code indexing, so it can kind of like index your repository, and it doesn't matter if you need to open up like a new context window. It will remember what your project is about. You can ask it, it'll summarize it real quick. And it made it easier it made it more efficient. You know, it was wasting less time explaining to the AI model like what my project is, what I need done. It's very useful too because my current process is TDD, and so I'm using like Jest and TypeScript where I give it, I make it go in ask mode. I talk about it like the idea that I have. It sets up a game plan and it goes, "Are you ready for me to implement this?" And I go, "Yeah, just make sure you do TDD." And I could always put that in a rules file too, but I do like the interactive. Like I feel like I'm talking to the
Yeah.
AI, so I have more fun with it. And so once it gets everything working, gets everything tested, we run the tests, we run the build all tool, and then I will refresh the local extension. I'll check for errors there and I'll test it locally. Cause like right now, like even though I haven't shipped it to Chrome web
Hmm.
API yet, that's sort of my process. And it's great because there's even more features that Cursor has. Like I've heard that they have pretty cool like browser dev tools, even within the VS Code. But for right now, it's just about having a good understanding of what the web can do and just having these ideas and just being like, hey, here's my idea. We'll formulate into a plan. I kind of skim over the game plan, make sure that it makes sense to me. Then I just go have at it because, again, it doesn't mean that it's going to be the most well named tool or the most like refactored or performant or things like that. But for like right now, I just need it to work and it's working excellently and it's doing a ton of different things. And it kind of leads me into my next project when I am eventually going to learn more about things like MCPs or just trying to figure out the certain rules that I would need to just to like understand how to make something more modular or efficient or refactored a certain way. That's something that I feel comes in time anyway, in like a software engineering degree. So at least like for right now, I feel like I just try not to store everything within the same file. Like I've heard from developers that try to keep their functions like 100 files long or 100 lines long, just so that way they could always see the same thing on the same page. And so all that stuff will come in time, but that's Cursor is the main one that I'm using right now. Other times I'll use ChatGPT to sort of bounce ideas off of it, just so that way I can be like, hey, are there any security issues here? And then sort of like counter argue just to make sure that like I'm really making it hard. That like for example, and this is the last thing I'll say because I'm a very ranty person. Initially, my Chrome extension was just auto loading on each page because I had it on all URLs. And so as I'm finishing up with Cursor, I'm asking ChatGPT, what should I need to consider with my Chrome submission? And it's pretty cool because I can even use my app now on the Chrome documentation. So I'm like summarizing it there, asking questions with ChatGPT. And basically the issue is that all URLs can kind of be like a red flag if your like extension is
Oh,
just
interesting.
accessible everywhere. And so it suggested a more of like a user opt-in. Like you like actually have to click the extension for it to appear on a page. And that was easy enough to do. But again, just these types of like AI prompting, just be like, hey, I have a question. Do you have the answer? Can you link me to where you got the answer from? And then even now, I'm trying to use my tool. So if I'm on a web page such as um, what would you call it? GraphQL, TypeScript, Storybook. I want to be able to like go on a web page, summarize it very quickly, and then just like be able to set up a project way more quickly. Because I just feel like I read documentation a little bit slowly. And so I'm just trying to find something that can summarize documentation. And it's worked on a bunch of stuff so far. It's worked on technical docs, Wikipedia, health, medical stuff. So it's been pretty fun right now.
Yeah, I'm excited to see this when it's released, and when this episode's released, you should hopefully be in the Chrome store at that point.
Yeah, that's the
So
game plan.
so what's next for you professionally? You are out there looking. What are you looking for your next opportunity?
I would say I'm looking for a junior software engineer role just as much. I'm looking for a front end web developer role. I'd even be open to something more on the support analytics or a data analyst role because something I'm starting to notice is that AI can actually have a greater benefit in other fields than necessarily like software development, because now it's like software development, they're replacing people. You know what I mean? Like you can just have people added to the Copilot in GitHub and assign it tickets. And that thing, if prompted from a senior engineer, might be able to replace someone faster than a junior developer. I don't really like how like overworked it feels sometimes in software engineering, where like I like the idea that like if you finish your work assigned in a week, you can have some time to relax. You can have some time to upskill. You can have some time to plan for the next week. I just don't like the type of roles where it's just like you're going to do as much as you can do at the highest level until you're burnt out, and then we're going to let you go, or we're just going to, expect more of you at that point. I would say just those 4 degrees of separation. The junior software engineer, because I'm still trying to get into the full stack. I'm front end leaning, but I think with the right role, with the right programming languages, the right products, I'll excel in for sure. Front end developer is the thing that I have the most professional experience in, and it comes a little bit easier to me now. And then again, support analytics and data analytics, because I like to talk to people. Data, I really like making sure that it's like reliable and not like redundant. Like I like cleaning data. I've used Python in the past, a little bit of R. I've used Excel, like even at my most recent cafe, they had this like calculation they needed to do on their worksheets, and I was able to figure that out on Excel right before I got started at my new job. And I did a lot of that with ChatGPT. Again, it was just about figuring it out, like what these things mean, and just making sure that you truly understand the solution and like breaking the code and everything, like before you're just like, all right, here's your solution. But I I think that either an analytics or developer role would be something that I'm looking for next. And I'm kind of indifferent to it. I'm really just looking for the next opportunity. I can work in person, I can work remotely, hybrid, whatever.
And if people are listening and want to get in touch with you about a possible opportunity or just learn more about what work you're doing, what is the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Yeah, definitely. It's through LinkedIn. I think we'll have it in the show notes, right? My thing is like John or Micah Hamo. I'm Jonathan Hammond on LinkedIn, and I'll make sure to provide my GitHub and email on the show notes too.
Yeah. Well, Johnny, it was a pleasure learning about you and pleasure speaking with you for the last hour. So if anybody wants to get in touch with Johnny, I will have all of his information in the show notes as well. So feel free to reach out to him there. But Johnny, I really appreciate your time today.
Brian, thank you so much for having me on. Appreciate you, and happy holidays.
Yeah, happy holidays.